Welcome to this podcast on riding the emotional curve. When we have brave conversations with people, very often we're discussing something which both we find challenging to get across, but also maybe the other person finds a little bit challenging to receive. Therefore, often we kick them into an emotional reaction. And when that happens, they end up experiencing the same range of emotions that we do when we're going through the change cycle. It's called the emotional curve or the change curve. It actually comes from a model by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, which was based on the bereavement curve. The reality is we can predict the stages that people are going to go through and the emotions that they're going to experience when we challenge them and when they get thrown into the emotional curve. But what we can't necessarily do is predict the speed at which they go through them. Because for some people, the process could take a matter of seconds as they work through each stage. So you may hardly notice, but for others it may take months and they may get stuck in certain phases. So when we're having brave conversations, it's really important to help people through the change curve so that you manage each of those stages effectively. When they get that piece of feedback, when we're having a brave conversation, the first thing you might have is shock. They might not have expected it, might not have heard before. And then very often we're going to get a bit of denial. So they're going to get defensive or say, oh God, no, it wasn't me, I never meant that. And depending on how they react, we then may get a bit of anger. We can then go into the blame mode, so they can blame others, and it could be everybody else's fault but them. And then eventually, if they're beginning to accept it, they might blame themselves. We also might have a little bit of bargaining. They might be going, so is that really the case? Did that really happen? I'm not really sure whether I meant it that way. So they could try and bandy around whether or not the situation happened in the way you perceived it or not. And then actually, we end up with a little bit of apathy, a bit of depression. Because that point is when we're at the tipping point, when they're moving into acceptance that actually they maybe need to do or act slightly differently. At acceptance, we're at the point where we can move forward. And we can then explore what they want to do, understand what the best way to do that, think in new ways forwards for solutions, and then move forward and sustain them. So it's important that we are managing each of those stages effectively. The curve is essentially divided into two halves, with apathy and depression at the bottom. The first bit is we've got to deal with the past and what's happened. The second part is we've got to look at how we move forward. So I want to talk with how we deal with the past first of all. So in that shock stage, we really need to acknowledge and show empathy. For example, say, I accept that this, the feedback I'm giving you was unexpected. And at the same time, we need to find a way forward. In the denial stage, we need to acknowledge the points that they're making and maybe use some disarming techniques. For example, I'm really sorry I gave you that impression, or that was the last thing I wanted to happen. Make sure when you're having a brave conversation that you're communicating face to face and that you really focus on the what's in it for me part of the message. We want to get this to land, but also to move forward and get an outcome. It's not about being right and wrong. It's about finding a solution. The third, if we're met with anger, again, we need to acknowledge and use disarming techniques. Allow people to express their issues. Give them time to understand the feedback that you're giving them or the change that they're going through, and keep the communication channels open. Keep talking. If somebody's getting to the blame stage, we really need to show empathy and test understanding, but also don't get drawn into the blame. Don't be that person who helps add fuel to the fire. So, for example, you could say, so what you're saying is, or if they say, well, other people have been doing the same thing, you could come across with, well, I'm unaware of that, or I can't comment on that. Also, at this point, they could blame you. So be really mindful to ignore personal slights because they're very much a diversion tactic. The fifth stage in dealing with the past is when we're getting to that bargaining state. And this could be where actually we're going to hit the sticking point. And we really need to get through this before we can move on and get a solution. So start dealing with that sticking point if people are getting hung up on an issue by asking more questions. So you could say, for example, can you accept that this is the situation? Or what would convince you to acknowledge that this has happened? And then also restate your objectives. Restate what you want to get from the conversation. Whatever you do when you're dealing with the past, don't avoid the issue or soften the message. If we faff around too much at the beginning and make it a little bit too fluffy, somebody might miss the point. And if we're too nice and too conciliatory, actually, do you know what? We're going to make that change and that shock even bigger. Don't try and shortcut to the solution when the person's still in shock and denial. The thing that we always do often when we're having a brave conversation is go, this is the issue, so how are we going to move forward? And when you do that, we're short-circuiting all of those emotions, and people don't get to work their way through that. And they've got to go through acceptance before you will get a solution that sticks. Don't also ignore their emotions. You know, they may have an emotional reaction. Show empathy, understand, let them experience it. However, don't get sucked in and react emotionally yourself, because that's not going to help the situation. And don't attack the person or defend your ideas or behaviours, because that's not going to help either. Most importantly, avoid using a statement like, yes, I completely agree, but, or however, instead of but, because however is just a posh but. Our brain's hardwired to ignore everything before the but. But means no. So don't use the word but or however when you're having a brave conversation. Use and, or just pause for a minute, because otherwise the person is going to switch off and ignore everything that you said before the but. So that takes us through the past, through stages 1 through 5. How then do we move it forward? If we get to the bottom, when we get to that depression stage or apathy stage, that's fantastic, because do you know what? We're at the point where we've got the ability to tip this and move forward. So you need to break through the resistance. And it might be as simple as saying, you know, what do you want me to say to you right now? Or how can we move forward from here? Putting the ball in the other person's court and giving them the freedom and the autonomy to make the choice of how they move forward is going to be much more effective. You want them to buy into what you're going to do going forward. So if you try and enforce what that looks like or impose your solutions, you're much more likely to get compliance rather than agreement. So let them come up with the suggestions for how you move forward. When we've got to acceptance, we are now at that point where we can start to move the conversation to future actions. So you could ask something like, so what do you think we should do then? And make sure you concentrate on priorities here. Don't get distracted by little minor things. As you're moving through this, explore what those future action steps are like and discuss it. Ask great open questions. You know, what can we do about that? And set achievable and sustainable short-term goals. At the understanding stage, agree the way forward between you. Acknowledge that those who are responding to the change or to the feedback, and empower and involve them in the next stages for how you move forward. This is a two-way thing. You need to do it in partnership. And then finally, the final stage is get commitment. You need to get them to commit to the changes that you're going to do. Set dates to review and agree when you're going to feedback on progress. You know, at this part, you can start setting slightly longer term goals and really concentrate on making changes and different ways of working that allow you to move back to a business as usual way. If you're not sure they're committed, go back in, restate what you want to get out from it, and get agreement from them. Whatever you do when you're working forward, don't ramble and skirt around the issue. Also, don't fail to ask enough questions. You need to spend most of your time in questioning mode here, understanding what the resistance is and getting this person's point of view, because you only know the bit you know. You don't know how they feel about stuff. Also, make sure that you get a commitment, because if you don't get a commitment, it probably means you're going to be back having another brave conversation sometime along the line. And also, make sure that you don't fail to follow up and give positive feedback when you're seeing that behaviour change or what you've put into effect change. Praise people, give them feedback, say you appreciated it. It's going to make them much more willing to move forward. So hopefully this podcast has given you a little bit of an idea of how you can handle those stages more effectively and enable you to have those brave conversations in a much more impactful way.